Hello, welcome to the Viewpoint. I am Mamadou Mboj. Since the emergence of the coronavirus disease in Wuhan, China, some 4 months ago, some 2.5 million people have been infected and nearly 170,000 have died from it worldwide. And in Africa, we know that nearly 25,000, as we speak, perhaps the numbers are going up, nearly 25,000 have been infected and more than 1,000 have died. And in Gambia, so far, 10 infected, 1 person has died. But so far, what we've seen, around the world, what patterns are beginning to emerge? What lessons can be learned? The measures we're taking right now to contain the disease, are they effective? I'm here to help me answer these questions and more, to people eminently qualified to help me answer them. I've got Dr. Ismaila Baji, who has a doctorate degree in pharmacy in the University of Purdue in Lafayette, Ohio, USA. And he also is with Innovarex Healthcare Solutions Company. And on my left, I have Mr. Ade Darami. Everybody knows the famous Ade, QTV news editor, been with the BBC for a long time, more than 15 years, and still contributes articles to that fabled publication. Gentlemen, welcome to the Viewpoint.
Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Baji, I'll begin with you. The question baffling everybody else, the low numbers. we have to begin with that. 10 so far, our first reported case on the 17th of March, now April, towards the end of April.
Yeah.
10, only 1 death.
Yeah.
What's your theory? What's your hypothesis? What's going on there?
Yeah, so I think it's a mystery. And I call it a mystery because it's not a Gambia thing. It's like the great African mystery, right? You have, Africa is populated, right? But what we're seeing, sometimes it almost doesn't make sense because all the world is going to massive numbers in the hundreds of thousands. But yet Africa, it's showing that it's not a lot, but also the testing disparity is huge, right? So as we always say, just because something is not, you're not finding something doesn't mean it's not there. Right, so that's the challenge that I think Africa has. I think if you want to take it from a population standpoint, I don't think we've even tested 0.5% of our population. So it's hard to extrapolate. If it could have made sense if we tested, let's say, 10,000 Gambians, for example, randomly, with or without symptoms, to kind of get an assessment. But until that happens, sometimes the numbers may not make all the sense, but we're working within the confines of what we have. So it's just one of those things where you brace for impact until you know what it actually, where we're going to land.
Yes. But would you say that there would be a tipping point at which we'll begin mass testing? How do we know?
I think that should be the hope. And I think that's the hope when almost every single day our news now is just how much supplies we're getting, how much testing we're getting. So I think it'll be encouraging at some point too when we see that, okay, now instead of testing about 400 or 500 so far, that's more self-reported cases, we could get to a point where we could test 10,000 Gambians, 20,000 Gambians, where every region you randomly select. So that's the hope. And I think that's why the world is they have commitments to increase testing capability in Africa, because that's the biggest disparity between us and the West. The West is testing a lot because they have the capability.
Absolutely. Ade, first, your thoughts on the numbers, and secondly, this baffling disease, one can say discombobulating new phenomenon, but it's not unhistorical.
It's not. I mean,
you know what I mean? Throughout history, if you go back the centuries, the world, we've seen pandemics. We often say that there's a reason why half die in Banjul is called half die.
Indeed, indeed.
Yes.
I mean, on the numbers, I'm as baffled as anyone else. And, I think Dr. Baji has kind of mentioned some of the things that we have to consider when we're talking about this and we're talking about the numbers. But again, if anybody watching and anybody who listens to me, they always hear me talk about Sierra Leone, they hear me talk about Cape Verde. And if we look at those two countries and their numbers, 2 weeks ago, Sierra Leone had none. And as of the time of this program, they have 61. 2 weeks ago, Cape Verde only had 6, of which 1 had died, a British tourist, 60-year-old. And as of the time of this recording of this program, they have 67. So those numbers, these are near neighbors of ours. And these are also countries where, particularly in Sierra Leone, because of the whole historical, recent history of Ebola, there's a lot more testing.
That's it. I was about to ask that, but perhaps that's the difference. There's
Yes.
a lot more testing over there, perhaps, than we have in this country.
That's
for
right.
instance.
And some of the structures that had been built up as a result of Ebola, what were meant to be temporary hospitals, eventually became permanent hospitals because of how well built they were. So there was no need, no sense in dismantling them. In fact, some of them were expanded upon. And so come COVID-19, they've actually used some of those facilities now and kind of redeployed them. And they're testing a lot more. They're still having the same problems that we're having here, where A, you have a lot of people who don't think that it's anything, and B, you have people who think they can break out of quarantine. So over the weekend in Sierra Leone, in the northern part of Sierra Leone, it was quite a curious case because they had 29 people who had been quarantined for 14 days. They were about to be released, and 2 of them tested positive. And so they were told that they would all have to go back into quarantine. And they broke out. So what they agreed in the end was that actually they would allow them to self-isolate at home because they had, because some of them reasoned, and when you think about the reasoning they used, it's not unreasonable. They were saying that, well, these 2 people were here and they got it, and we were about to be cleared. What's to say if we stay here, we're not going to get it. So allow us to go home. So they've been allowed home. And so, you know, they're now meant to self-isolate, and they'll be monitored on a daily basis to make sure that they're adhering to the self-isolation. Now, you talk about historical. As you know, history is my field. And so I've been reading newspaper cuttings from 1918 when
That's
they
very
had.
true, yeah.
It is remarkable
Yes.
how similar the symptoms, the reactions. In the British newspapers, they were printing on a daily basis saying, be a patriot, stay home, don't go out. I mean, it's almost like you're reading something from last week. It really is
So
quite...
it's like an archetypal reaction. It's an
Indeed.
archetype. You can find it.
Absolutely. And in England at the time, they were worried about, as one newspaper said, how are you going to keep Johnny entertained when he has to stay away from school for 2 weeks? You know, things like that. Well, so the reaction is almost identical, and it was quite spooky reading some of these newspaper articles from 1918, Spanish flu as it was, which of course killed many, many people. So we've had a history of it. Of course now, because of communication, something happens here now, today, 10 minutes later, it's everywhere. Somebody's taken a picture or a video with their phone and they've uploaded it. And the whole world gets to know about it. In some of those instances in 1918, the news did not get through for many, many years. In fact, what was interesting to read were they had newspapers that had reports from the colonies, including Gambia, including Sierra Leone. And of course, some of them weren't reporting any cases for a very long time. And so the people back home were saying, oh, you know, maybe we should be there, rather than, which is again quite ironic. So there is historical precedence, of
Absolutely,
course.
and there when you were talking about the Ebola in Sierra Leone and the structures you had built to contain that and how that is helping you here. I spoke to a WHO officer who was trying to make similar claims for the Gambia. I said, yes, perhaps then the structure we had in place prevented it from coming in. But once now this is in, the processes of or the mechanisms of containment have not been tested. we really do not know yet how they will stand up to this. But more that point and more. And we've seen recently a sort of increase in infectious diseases. How would we be the SARS, the MERS, is it H1N1, is it Zika, dengue fever? I mean, what is going on here?
I think a couple of things to Ade was saying about the Ebola and history. I think it also shows you our ability to learn or not learn.
Or not, right?
Yes.
Quite.
And Sierra Leone is a good example because what Ebola did was when it came to contact tracing, which is the cornerstone for the coronavirus, Ebola made them systemize contact tracing to a point where you're just picking up a playbook that's already built, right? So the systems helped a lot. But comparing it to 1918, travel
I'm glad you made the point, because if you hadn't, that was the point I was going
Travel.
to make.
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Like we have some airports that hundreds of millions of people pass through in a year. So when you add infectious disease, anything that's communicable, close contact, it's always a minefield.
Sure.
It takes days to blow up. But also the pattern takes a while. There's a trickling effect,
Sure.
right? Because it spreads fast, so somebody's peak in January could be another country's peak in October.
Sure.
While all of that is happening, our only savior is a vaccine, which doesn't happen until 2021, right? So it makes it a little bit more of a stark contrast, but travel has a lot to do with it, which Gambia is a good case.
Yeah.
All our cases, somebody was from Dubai,
Yeah, of course.
somebody from Bangladesh, imported cases. We have 2 cases that are come from local transmission, which also sends an alarm.
We are
Because
known for tourism.
we're known for tourism,
So-
right? So a lot of different factors, but travel has a key component to it. Because the next one is going to come, which is what I tell people. History shows us that it could be a virus again, it could be bacteria that's resistant to antibiotic, so it's going to come, right? But systems are really, really important. So most countries that have systems already in place, I think they're handling it better
Yes.
because it's easier.
I was listening to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's principal secretary whilst Ebola was going on in Liberia.
Yeah.
And he said something very interesting to me. He said any crisis, any health crisis, sooner or later becomes a crisis of governance. Was China slow to tell the world?
I think, the people who are cowardly might say too early to say, because we owe China so much around the world. But if we want to be brave, I think we'd have to say yes. They are very known for containing news and even suppressing news. And so it must have been something they felt they could deal with, and to the exclusion of the rest of the world. But as Dr. Baji rightly says, travel has completely blown that out of the water. Because in February of this year, I went to Liverpool and we had a stopover in Istanbul airport. Now that airport sees something like 150,000 passengers a day, every day. And we were there for about 10 hours because of the long layover. You can imagine we weren't sitting in a single place. We crisscrossed. They even have now beds where you can sleep free of charge. And so you have all of that, that intermingling, that crossing. So China must have known that we're talking about an area where people would have traveled to and from the whole world, from the rest of the world. And so they should have alerted the rest of the world. And if you remember, I think people these days, there's very much short-term memory. But one of the first journalists from China who alerted the world was arrested, and we never heard from him again. Because, they said he was spreading false information, he was spreading, alarm. But my gosh, look at where we are now. And that arrest was all of 4 months ago. Can you imagine, had they not taken that sort of action? And I think that kind of action in arresting somebody who was essentially a whistleblower, that tells you how they were trying to manage. There are certain things you cannot manage. They take on a life of their own.
That's it, absolutely. And the doctor was in it, Liang. I mean,
that's right.
He was paraded on TV apparently to recant, to say that there were rumors so that he could recant. So this is it. The medical aspects, you medical people, you have to deal. There's also the element of the politics.
Yeah, and
it
honestly,
makes it very difficult.
Even looking at it strictly from a scientific medical standpoint, I think that's the most frustrating part of this whole ordeal, because it shifts from public welfare, public health situation to now a battle or game of optics and PR. So even China, yes, you could claim that, but also the China playbook to a certain extent, a lot of governments are now using, right? Because it's always, okay, I don't want to be brutally honest with our reality, because that could be a sign of incompetence, when it's not a sign of incompetence, because nobody was prepared, right? So by the time the information is delivered with a level of seriousness, you're dealing with a virus who does not participate in the game of PR. So the damages could be harmful. And that's the hardest part, where the science, epidemiologists, virologists, medical research scientists should be at the forefront of the conversations, because they could actually tell people this is how this system works. Viruses are predictable. We know if it's contagious, if it's communicable. These are the patterns. The vaccine, it's our only hope. It's not going to be till a year from now. So conversations like that. I think PR and optics makes it muddy.
Absolutely. And once we talk about that, just before you say that, then WHO comes into it.
Indeed.
Did they? Well, Trump calls WHO China-centric.
Yes.
What do you make of that? Were they slow in declaring a pandemic? Were they relying on China too much, the information perhaps not being able to confirm for themselves?
I think that's a crucial point, because I think the fact that Tedros Ghebreyesus, who's the head of WHO, China very much supported his candidature, and it was now being commented on whether, in fact, he trusted them too much to be kind of an honest broker and come forward with the information at the time they should have come forward. And even if he took advice from them as to how they were handling it, and that then ended up being WHO advice, don't wear masks, don't do this, don't that, and then another time they'll say wear masks. So there was that. And to be honest, even though there has been a lot of criticism of him, I think one of the missteps he made was, in all the criticism he got, I mean, he didn't come out and criticize Trump, but he came out and criticized Taiwan, which again, of course, we know how difficult China's relationship is with Taiwan, where China still claims that it's part of China.
But Taiwan is still not part of the WHO, isn't it? It's China blocking it.
China's blocking their entry into it, yes. And so, he came out, he named them, said that they were behind some of the more racist accusations. And of course, they've kind of called his bluff and said, tell us where, when, and we will apologize, but if you can't find it, then we want you to apologize. So that's kind of muddied the waters, because they see him as very much owing something to China, because China was so supportive of his candidature. Mind you, so were all the rest of the African countries. But yes, with 2020 vision in 2020, we're all saying that they were slow, because this should have been something that should have alerted the whole world much quicker. But then you're talking about governance and leadership. Trump was very bullish in not accepting some of the advice from the experts, because as he famously said, met these doctors and they're astonished at how much I know about this disease.
Absolutely. And he said, was it on the 4th of February? He said that it was at a rally. He said, don't worry, very soon the warm weather would come and they will miraculously go. He used that term, miraculously, quite interesting.
This is it. So you had, WHO wanting to give advice, coming up against leaders who were quite reluctant. And again, what Dr. Bachi was mentioning about optics, there are certain countries, ourselves included, Gambia, Cape Verde, where tourism is a big part of our economy. And the fact that in Cape Verde, the 67 cases, 45 of them are not just on one island, Bovista, they're in one hotel, 45 out of 67. And those, and amongst 45 members of staff, I should say, as well as the 45 members of staff, you have 10 tourists. And so there's this thing about, so imagine 55 out of the whole 9 islands. There are 3 islands that have no cases in Cape Verde, and there's island of São Vicente has 1. So it's very concentrated. Well, because they rely so much on tourism, they didn't want to stop the tourists coming in when this would have been the sensible thing. But many of them are now saying, well, if we had received guidance from WHO, this is what we should do, stop flights and so on, we would have stopped it. But you suspect that some of them were resisting it because you think of the economic impact. Here in the Gambia, where all these hotels and restaurants and nightclubs have had to close, casinos, my son lives in Las Vegas, he said it's like a ghost town, so people have those considerations. And I read today, just before we came here, someone in America saying, I don't care if I go out there and I die eventually, I want to get back to work because my car note is due and my mortgage is due. This was in America, where there's a famous picture now which has gone viral, where somebody comes out in a mask and a sort of PPE and confronts the people who are waving their flag saying we want to be out on the street. You know, so there's so many things that have to be taken into consideration. And it's kind of, you know, there can't be a one-size-fits-all.
No.
Because even if WHO says social distancing or physical distancing in one place, it doesn't work in some countries.
At all. We'll come back to that. To this disease, sometimes we do hear people say stuff like, it is a man-made disease. It is important that we confront these arguments. This is the time that good argument must drive out bad. It's a man-made disease. Have we really established the source? And in many ways, how does it compare with other diseases we have? Flu, TB. What do you make of that?
And I think whenever there's uncertainty, it's a breeding ground for conspiracy, right? And that's also human nature. Yes. Anything we don't understand, we assign something to it, and then somebody will believe it. So I always take all the conspiracy theories and put it to the side. And that's why even WHO, they have one of the hardest jobs in the world, especially in a moment of leadership, right? Because even if you get information from a scientific standpoint, all you could do is, okay, this is similar to SARS or MERS. Yeah. But at that time, there's no way of knowing that this infectious rate, how fast it transmits from person to person, is going to be exponentially higher and faster. Yeah. So most of the decisions could influence it, which coronavirus, the class of viruses, is not new. There's similarities to it. It's a severe, respiratory disease. So in the beginning, those are the assumptions that scientifically you could make. Okay, the crown, it looks like this. This is how the pattern is. It's spread to respiratory droplets. And you start making decisions based on that information. And then as you go along, which the past 4 months has shown us, with more information comes different strategies. How fast is going? People go from mask, okay, actually wear a mask now, because they can't contain it. So the virus is always moving faster than the science community. But I think this is why the people who deliver the information should always, one, debunk all the myths and conspiracy. No, it's not 5G. We have no proof saying that it's man-made. Most of these class of viruses, yes, in the past, there's closeness to animals. There's that transfer, right? From MERS, it was camels. SARS, I think it was bats or cats, one of those things.
Ebola, monkeys.
Right, Ebola, monkeys. Yeah. So that's a pattern we know. And that's something people should understand, because the moment you say man-made, you're assigning intention of somebody wanting to do harm to a fellow man. And that's like a rich accusation to make.
And it's one that's not likely to go away.
Yeah.
Because until all these great powers, G7, G20 countries, until they announce that they have all shut down their chemical warfare labs, there will always be that suspicion, because that's what chemical warfare is all about.
And even
using
when Ebola came out as well, people said that somebody had injected something, they want to kill Africans, and that sort of thing.
Yes, and Tulane, the American, they were actually testing that in Sierra Leone. And so it made sense, actually, for people to link, saying, well, did it leak out from there accidentally and start killing people? Now, the kind of, I'm glad you brought up this thing about killing Africans, because, I even just yesterday, and I can honestly say without fear of contradiction, since this COVID-19 started, I've had an argument about this with somebody somewhere in the world. And what I've said to them is that if it's not very efficient, because, and just even this morning I had to pull out the World Malaria Report. Okay, so the most recent one that I could find, that any of us could find, was WHO's report from 2018, which listed figures from the 1st of January 2017 to 31st of December 2017. Worldwide, there were 290 million people who got malaria. 430,000 died. 92% of them were in Africa. Now, that tells you that the reason the rest of the world, and if you looked at the figures for 10 years before, they were much bigger. But the reason Africa now has 92% is because the environments in our country are conducive to mosquitoes. They're not clean enough to starve mosquitoes of their breeding grounds. And that's all it takes to eradicate malaria overnight. Never mind, MRC spent all those years looking for a vaccine. Actually, it is within the countries that have eliminated it, didn't use a vaccine. They cleaned up their environment.
Yeah.
So if you want to kill Africans, malaria is doing a much more efficient job than COVID-19.
So this is a doctor.
Absolutely.
I do hear people say that, look, we've got all these diseases around, they're killing far more. We never lock down, we never close businesses, we never do any of this. Why is the coronavirus different? How is it different?
Because it's a communicable disease, that there is no vaccine, nor they have not established any treatment for it. That's why it's dangerous, right? Most of the diseases, there's either a vaccine or treatment that you could take. Even if somebody, in 2020, you could be HIV positive and live the highest quality of life. It's actually not a death sentence anymore. But anything, even if, let's say, 2% of people are dying, that's cause for concern.
Yeah.
Right? Because people live close to each other, people travel a lot. So we have to take it serious because there's no treatment. Even the whole hoopla, going back to myths about hydroxychloroquine. The research, it's not showing that this is effective, but for the past 2 months so far, so many people have bought the disease that it's caused more harm. So until we could get a treatment or a vaccine, I think we have to take it serious until we understand or at least get a hold of it. But at the same time too, like you said, more Gambians will die from hypertension, more Gambians will die from diabetes, more asthma, smoking, and now coronavirus is actually showing us that all these underlying conditions puts you at a higher risk. So even if COVID-19 is gone, we still have battles to fight when it comes to non-communicable diseases.
And I'm glad you used those. And I'm glad you used those figures to put it into context, because what I said to my staff when they were getting worried, I asked them this question. I said, how many people officially have died for COVID-19? They said 1 in the Gambia. I said, again, 1. I said, what's your point? I said, well, in that time, when that one person has died, 20 people have been killed on the roads here. And yet we're not stopping cars from being on the roads. But as you rightly say, when something is communicable, when it's easily transferred, and then that's when we fear. It's the same with Ebola. For all the fear and whatever there was about the numbers that were killed by Ebola, when it was all over, it killed less than 5% of the numbers who died from malaria in the 3 countries that were affected in the West African sub-region. So Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia. More people died from malaria. 95% more of the deaths were more attributable to malaria than to Ebola. But of course, Ebola was scary because it was so easily communicable. And that's, as you rightly say, with COVID-19, we don't know what the cure is yet.
Precisely.
That's the scary bit.
Exactly. So here you will help us. When we hear that so and so number have recovered, what do we mean by that?
So actually, okay, so far majority of the people, if you're infected, you have a milder case of the disease. But when I say mild, it means you're still going to be sick. You may have the coughing, you may have the fever, right? But you're not going to get sick enough where your lungs cannot breathe for yourself anymore. Those are the advanced cases who now then need a ventilator. So which is why when people hear, oh, we don't have enough ventilators, that means the severely ill cases, their lungs lose capacity to breathe, which is, it could be a death sentence. But even the US, what they're finding is even people who make it to a ventilator, majority of them still don't make it, right? Which adds a whole new wrinkle to it. So yes, we don't have enough ventilators, but even if we had the state-of-the-art equipment, making it to a ventilator is not a guarantee that you're going to survive it, because it literally incapacitates the lungs. Your lungs will have so much fluid that you suffocate because you can't breathe anymore, right? So, but that's the minority. That's why majority of the people going back to travel, I'm pretty sure if we did mass testing of everybody who's traveled within the past 5 months, going through transits like Turkey. I flew to Royal Air Maroc in January. I was there for 18 hours, right? There's no telling that people already have had COVID, which came off as a mild cold, they got over it, but they were in the majority of the people who don't get the severe case, right? So that's very that's why even treatment, from a pharmacy standpoint, that's why you hear supportive care. That's all you do. Yeah. There's different levels of supportive care. Supportive care could be, I have a fever, let me take a fever reducing agent and monitor my temperature. Advanced supportive care could be intubation, getting on a ventilator, because you're on a severe case, until something happens.
Absolutely. I mean, that was really the fear, that perhaps the medication or the equipment we need, because a lot of people here do have underlying conditions.
Sure.
You have this huge vulnerable group, and I understand that something similar happened in Zimbabwe. Somebody from a reasonably wealthy family, but he had a problem. He had problem breathing. Took him to the hospital. There were no ventilators. So maybe this is the fear that perhaps most people will die from that sort of thing, the inadequacy of the health system.
It is, and you know, I can reveal here, I have a cousin. He's a first cousin who's going through this now in the UK. We got a message yesterday from the hospital that we're monitoring him because we've given him, I don't know, the doctor can explain this, the maximum amount of oxygen we're allowed to give him, was the message we got yesterday. We're getting daily reports. And that was quite scary because his condition's quite fragile, but he also had an underlying condition. He had a heart condition, and that he was being treated for. And again today, this morning, there was on the BBC a professor who's actually a lecturer at a medical institute in Plymouth, in England, and he survived. And he wrote an article about it for the BBC about how he survived, and the fact that when he found out that the 3 people who treated him were students that he had taught.
Wow.
Including the person who operated on him, as he said, saved his life. He said, but probably the thing that really saved his life was that when he was still going to work and was recording a very high temperature, he refused to get checked. This is a doctor, somebody who lectures at a medical school. His doctor insisted, and and his temperature was 39. Wow. That's when she said, you have to go in and get tested. And then he was tested and found to be positive. And now 3 weeks later, he's recovered. And you know, but he went through all of this. And there, they have ventilators, of course. But even there, they're struggling. So if they're struggling, what about us? So we keep hearing about these, you know, medical equipment coming in. We keep hearing about donations from private individuals, from countries, and so on. And we can only welcome them because if we get the spike that has been predicted, then we'll be in trouble. And you and I had this discussion because I said that essentially these are computer simulations.
Yeah.
And so Cape Verde should have had a lot more cases, and they should have had 17 deaths, 18 deaths as of today. They've still only had 1. So it's unpredictable, but it's not a reason for complacency. So things like ventilators are very much needed. And what it's taught us is that we should not wait for something like this to have things that are meant to be standard equipment. You know, in 2007, I once wrote a paper for the Australian government saying that they should have district health centers of excellence, where everywhere you went in the country, the hospitals, you should have at least one that's as well equipped as the best in the capital. So that if the president happened to be traveling and he fell sick, you didn't have to fly him abroad. You could actually treat him there and then. It never happened. The paper gathered dust, you know, but that's what we should have. Absolutely. And that's what this has taught us now.
Big time, isn't it? So many times we've talked about how the leaders, whenever they're ill or their families, they'll go out. They keep on touting that they're doing the best. We've got this good.
That Nigeria's president could go for 5 months to the UK for medical treatment and stay there for 5 months. It's beyond belief.
But absolutely. But right now, you can't go anywhere.
No.
We are all in it together, really, for the first time. We do hear stuff like there's a more low mortality rate, and then we've also heard that kids are the least, those are the least risk group of dying. How should we interpret this information?
Just as numbers that we have right now. Data, especially right now, every piece of information we're using to make informed decisions could change tomorrow. If the world, let's say Gambia or another country X, woke up tomorrow and had 50,000 cases of coronavirus under the age of 18, it changes the whole landscape of how we communicate about the virus. So you take everything with a grain of salt. Even Gambia is a good case, because initially it was like, oh, it's an old man's disease. And then all of a sudden we had like 4 cases of under 30,
That's right.
right? 28,
right.
28, 20, and 20.
20, yeah.
And now the average age for cases in the Gambia is 41.
Yeah.
So information changes every so often because immune systems are different. So until we get to a final assessment, once we go past it, that's when we could make a better assessment. Okay, this was the mortality rate, this was the age group. What's known is the underlying conditions, which is why that's where I'm most passionate about. Because everything that's been consistent from country to country is showing you that people who are obese, heavier than they should be, people who have diabetes, that's under control, people who have hypertension, that's under control, people who have heart conditions, asthmatics, smokers, it puts you at risk. Because a smoker is twice as likely to get pneumonia than a non-smoker. And when you say smoker, that's an old man thing. No, kids consume more shisha now than older people do, right? So the underlying conditions is where I get scared for Gambia, actually. Because we see the amount of non-communicable disease, and we know a lot of people who are hypertensive young, myself included. I'm actually hypertensive, not on medication, and it puts them at risk, right? So that's, and speaking of traveling, travel used to be privilege in Africa or in Gambia. Privilege looked like you take your mom, your dad, or yourself outside of Gambia for treatment. So you live in Gambia, but you don't consume Gambian healthcare. But now the airspace is closed. So where are you going to get your quality medications when almost half the medications on our market might be counterfeit? Where are you going to get your tests if you're diabetic and you need an A1C? Which facility? You can't run to Dakar, right? So it's also a time for us to look within, like he said, not Gambia, Africa.
Africa, yeah.
Which is why I always get uncomfortable when I turn on the news and I see donation, donation, donation. It makes me uneasy because in my mind, Africa is rich enough where people will respect us more if we called and said, we want to purchase 50,000 masks. Here's the money. We don't need help. African countries should be thinking that way, or even purchase it, produce it. Produce it. Because anybody who's giving you something for me, you're always indebted to that person.
Sure.
And that just should make us uncomfortable. So it's goodwill, it's great, but it's also not a good reflection on us as a continent.
Absolutely. What an exposure. We've been exposed in many ways. So here, then we go really now to the social costs of the measures we need to take to contain them. Would it be effective? The social distancing and perhaps, but in Gambia, perhaps potential lockdown. We do not know. How effective would it be? We hope, some people say that we hope that the cure wouldn't be worse than the disease. So you hear all of these things, but we have to confront these things. As you said, one size doesn't fit all, unfortunately.
It doesn't, but I think the message that has to go out is that in certain instances, there are certain measures that one has to and must abide by. But for governments, there's always a pull between, do we enforce these measures? They can do it in every European country. They can do it in America. They have a social security system to fall back on. You know, my son can be out of work as he has been, and he's still getting $1,000 a week from the two sort of payments that he's getting. There's nothing that's the equivalent of that here. You know, and so when you say to people, take fewer passengers in your taxi, in your minibus, close down non-essential shops, there is absolutely no fallback, you know, and this goes across, again, on Deutsche Welle today I was reading in Russia, they said this COVID-19 is probably the thing that's going to be the biggest challenge to Vladimir Putin, because he has shown that he is unable to do anything to address it. He's asked shops to close, but there's no fallback. And some of them have said, once we've laid off our staff, that is it. There is no coming back because the losses are so great. We still have rent to pay. So they spoke to people who had chains of shops around, and they've closed down, and that's it. They said, we will not be opening again. But when we've gone to him, and apparently one woman who is featured, she ranted at him for 13 minutes, and there's a clip of her having a go at him for 13 minutes, saying, you know, you act as this czar, but you've done nothing, you're completely inept. and apparently that was really, because that was live on TV, couldn't censor it. And it really has shaken the nation, like, hang on, this is Putin and he can't do anything to roll back this thing. And so those are some of the costs. And so in Africa, where, as I said, we don't have any kind of safety net, people are really, really going to struggle. We import far too much of our foodstuffs. Nothing coming in on the ports in terms of food or being freighted in. Let's start looking within to growing our own, eating. That's Yame said, grow what you eat and eat what you grow. I mean, you know.
I wish he did what he said.
Well, I was going to say it was more words than deeds with him, but that's what we should be doing. Yeah.
No, and I think, and the biggest challenge is, even from a business standpoint, so even from our business, right, we're running into the challenge now where even if we were ordering a raw material, let's say alcohol, to make hand sanitizers, where we've quadrupled the cost of just getting it to Gambia, if you could even get it to Gambia.
Yeah.
So now, even though it's something that the Gambian community desperately needs, if I'm buying it at 4 times the price and there's like a price gouging policy in place, the consumer can't get access to it. And some point it's going to happen with food. When our business owners, you're not in business to lose money, right? So if the difficulties with sourcing, there's so many raw materials in Gambia that you cannot source in the Gambia. You're at the mercy of the people who make it. So it's going to have trickling effect. And even medications, so many things 6 months from now, the supply chains are going to go down. The cost of acquisition is going to go up. And then priority of acquisition. What I tell people, if I'm a company in Gambia and I'm bidding for hand sanitizers against a company in America, who do you think the manufacturer is going to get it? Right? So we're even lucky because we're a U.S. company with Gambia as a franchise. So we're buying as a U.S. company.
Right.
So it still gives us some limitation in terms of priority. But it just makes it challenging. And it has a trickling effect where now business owners who care about their employees, if you're operating at a loss, it's only so much you could employ people. And we know how difficult it is. Our unemployment rate is high. So it's just a lot of systems that I'm glad a lot of the conversations now is, okay, we'll go through it. It's going to be hard. But let's start planning to build systems after. Systems that are more generated internally. Things that we could make, we could sustain, and at least survive when the next one happens. Because it's tough.
Absolutely. You say we will go through it, but that's the challenge now, isn't it? One understands the medical imperative of social distancing and all the rest of it. But again, our reality is that it's virtually impossible. I feel sorry for policymakers. I mean, surely the WHO one-size-fits-all may work in some countries, but not elsewhere. Some of the researchers in South Africa have done that, especially when it came to the AIDS virus. So you have to take the local context into consideration when you're coming with solutions. So if we ignore that, it wouldn't be effective, quite as effective as what it has been in other countries.
It's true.
Our problem.
And you know, because this message has been drummed into my head so much about social distancing and so on, when I see people on the street now greet and hug, I cringe. And I think, and even just seconds before we came here, somebody came to the office and met an old friend that he hadn't seen, and you know, they hugged, and again I cringed, and I'm thinking, where's the distancing? And some people are just not getting the message. And I have to say to you that twice this week I've had steaming arguments with people who tell me that this is all fakery and that it's a plot by African governments to get funding and money. I mean, that's something serious that we really have to deal with. So never mind the kind of social distancing, which goes completely against our nature and it's in our DNA to kind of greet and hug and shake hands. You know, to tell me the social, it's almost as if you're telling me to change color. I couldn't do it. And so it's very, very hard. So, routinely you will hear some of my colleagues say to another, when somebody breaks the rule, social distancing, they say it in a kind of joking way, but to make a point that, yes, this is at least one thing that should be universal, even if it goes against our nature, it goes against our habits. Like there's an article again on the BBC about somebody who's lived in a street for 10 years and because of social distancing is meeting her neighbors for the first time because she's gone down the whole street and taking pictures of all of them and asked them to come out and speak to her. And they've always been able to do that. And so it's easier to do that in that kind of society. In this society, it's almost impossible, and it's a struggle.
Yes, so this is it. We do hear that because this is like habits of a lifetime, really. How can you change it overnight? So when you bring structures, perhaps try to work around people instead of wanting people to change to suit the new structures in an emergency. I doubt it, maybe in the longer run. Has there been a failure of leadership? What do you think from your medical person? Because there's not been, maybe we haven't had anybody who would rouse the people, motivate them. We see presidents all over the world. They're coming out every year talking to the people because this is where you really need to have them on board. You really need to inspire your people in such moments. But again, when you see sometimes the lax attitudes out there, has there been a failure of leadership, be it political or religious or community? Everybody should really be singing from the same hymn sheet.
Yeah, so I think nothing motivates human beings more than fear. And I think Gambia, for us, because it's been drip, drip, drip on cases. The bottom hasn't fell open, right? People don't take something serious if they don't fear it. Our religious leaders have used fear to motivate human behavior. Our military has used it. Dictators exist because of fear. Africans respond to fear naturally, right? So there's element to it. Leadership, yes, I think, but leadership starts from within. I'm always hesitant to say, okay, this is a leadership problem. When there's a lot of elements to Gambians that we are a reflection of our leadership. Our reflection is a reflection of us. Going back to social distancing, I cannot point the finger at like leaders do more when our neighbors are not practicing social distancing. People are shaking hands. People are spreading misconception. Some people, educated people.
Yeah, that's the people I've been arguing
people
with.
of influence, right, who are not, and that's why Corona happened, because a lot of people who had the level of influence, be it a spiritual leader or a leader in your community, did not speak up loudly enough about it. So I think the onus is on us. Leaders will always be a reflection of the people. That's something I deeply believe in.
So do I actually, yes. How you live as a collective is a complete reflection of how you live as individuals. I'm not sure if one can run faster than the other. We are in this together. And you mentioned something, infodemics. Yes. Not just the pandemic. There's the infodemics. Information, debate, misinformation, disinformation. I mean, conspiracy theories, all sorts.
Bane of my life. I almost have a second. I almost have a second career correcting misconceptions and the infodemic, as Tedros famously called it. And he meant not just a kind of a tsunami of information, but a tsunami of incorrect and totally bogus and sometimes plain idiotic information. And it is exasperating because some of it is so nonsensical that you almost don't want to engage with it. But when, as Dr. Baji says, some intelligent people, or people you thought, as I told one of them, I said, I always used to think you were intelligent. And he said, are you insulting me? I said, that's for you to decide. Take these things on board and spread them. I mean, just today I decided to count the number of videos where people had sent me just this week, and we're in Wednesday, about various cures for COVID-19. There were 20. That's from Monday to now. and I thought, if I collected all the ones I've received from the beginning of this, I'd probably have over 100. And they're all at odds with each other. One of them even talks about, and people are sharing this, you should eat a certain number of apples a day. Are you serious? But people are sharing this. Build up your vitamin C, build up your vitamin D. I mean, come on. And so the infodemic, because some of it looks very authentic. You know, again, I joked about people, you know, drape a stethoscope around their neck, and they do a video, and suddenly it goes viral. You know, people, there's a French, I won't mention his name, a French professor who, he's a bit of a prankster. And his videos have been shared by people with a straight face, thinking that what he's saying is true. He's making fun of the whole nonsense, but they don't even get the joke. And so they're sharing it as if it's scientific fact. You know, and so you get all of that. It really is tiring, because you want to say to people, just stop and engage your brain. Think about some of the nonsense you're sharing. But people don't seem to want to do that. They're just lazy. And then when you send them the facts, they said, well, I just forwarded it. Well, please don't do it again. But they will.
Absolutely. I mean, the medics, even media people, I mean, you've got your work cut out for you, because I'm told that there's something called the negativity bias. People sort of like bad news.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's easier to spread some of this.
And we even get it, where, because obviously, even as a company that has a pharmacy component to it, I can't tell you the amount of people who text me, like, hey, do you have hydroxychloroquine? Or, hey, do you have azithromycin? And you know what's happening now? So hydroxychloroquine, people who have lupus, which is a very, very difficult autoimmune disease to manage, they need Plaquenil, which is hydroxychloroquine, to actually live a good quality of life. So now what's happened is this frenzy has caused a shortage. So there's people with lupus who are suffering, who need a medication that somebody has in their back pocket that doesn't need it, thinking that it's, but the information, and they're getting crafty, where they could say, Oxford says drink an apple, or, you know, take an air dryer and put it on your nose and you'll kill the vaccine. So the lies always get around the world, I think, half before the truth catches up to it. That's the same. So it's frustrating, which for medical people, it's even more frustrating. Like, how could 5G cause coronavirus when the radio frequency is as low as a radio sitting next to you? Then the whole world would have died. Or even the vaccine, where the community is going to be challenged, because when the vaccine is out, there's enough anti-vaccine people in the world right now, where the consumption people might be hesitant.
Oh no, I even said that yesterday. I said, when the vaccine comes, I can see African governments being toppled if they insist on having it in their countries, because people have worked themselves into a frenzy that this is a plot to kill African people. They will not entertain it. And you're right.
It's going to be a challenge. And granted, you still want to see both sides of the story. Science has had a very conflicting relationship with some experimental stuff. In the U.S., we hear about the Tuskegee experiment, where they were infecting like black people with syphilis. So there's a history of not trusting. But I think this is where also Africa has enough scientists, credible, who could decipher information. But if you take vaccines outside of the human history, people would have been dying by the thousands. Polio, measles, smallpox, right? So I always tell people, vaccines have done more good for human history than not. So if science proves it, and most vaccines are going through clinical trials right now, I think Oxford is supposed to start theirs tomorrow.
That's right, yes.
Right?
Yes.
Let the clinical trials, because clinical trials test for two things, safety and effectiveness. You do a large enough sample size, if it passes, then it's good for public consumption. But we have to be very careful about our negative sentiment towards vaccines, because that's our only savior.
Absolutely. We're coming towards the end. Here, well, I'd like to invoke our intellectuals. You know, they try to steer us away from what they call Afro-pessimism.
Indeed.
They came with their, what do I call it, Afro-optimism, but you call it Afro-romanticism.
I did. I was being
but surely we have to be optimistic. We have to believe that we can do it.
We have to, and I think we have to, you know, as they say, you know, the time is now. And they were reaching out in the letter that you referred to, where 50 African intellectuals had written to African leaders and so on, saying, you know, we have to believe, because, you know, not to believe is actually, you know, to sink into despair. And I think optimism has to be what drives us forward, and we have to grab that chance, yes.
That's it. Thank you very much, gentlemen. We've come to the end of the program. And thank you very much, listeners, for viewers. I do radio, so sometimes I confuse these things. Thank you, viewers, for joining us on the Viewpoint. Until next time, stay safe. Thank you.